warm welcome for everybody, of course, but a special welcome for Jonathan Spence, our guest speaker of tonight. When I was asked for the position of director of the John Adams Institute, my first reaction was that I loved to do it, but the continent was the wrong one. After 6 years living in China and working there, it was there where my heart was. Jonathan Spence was my hero, and what a wonderful thing I could make my dreams come true tonight, since Dr. Spence is living in America. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation and come speak tonight. Barend ter Haar, professor at the Leiden Sinological Institute, will in a moment address Dr. Spence in more detail than I do. But before I'll ask him to come and take the floor, I would like to give you some practical data. After the introduction, Professor Spence will talk for about 35 minutes. Yeah. Okay, I hope you can hear me better now. Yeah. So after Barend ter Haar introduction and after the... Hello. Did you hear what I was just saying or not? Shall I do it again? Well, anyway, after I step down, Barend ter Haar will come, I hope, and we'll give a very a detailed introduction for about 10 minutes, after which Jonathan Spence will talk for 35 to 40 minutes. After that, they will take place at the table and we'll start discussing what they talked about. And at a certain moment, the audience will be asked to ask questions as well, and you can use the microphones in the hall. And there will be no intermission tonight, and but there will be book signing after the talk. There will be book signing, I think, at the table where the books have been sold, and there will be drinks outside at the bar. I think we'll close about 9:45, but before we'll do so, I will come back and give you some new data on some events which we will try to organize before we actually break up in, we break in the break in the summer. So the only thing I have to ask you is switch off your mobile phones and don't smoke here in this beautiful hall, and ask Barend to come. Thank you.
We have at home that were written by Jonathan Spence. But it was a punishment, actually, because he wrote so darn much, and we only have half of it, luckily. And of course, now my notes are there. I hope you can understand me too. Okay. Well, good evening to you all. First, I thank the John Adams Institute and Professor Jonathan Spence to give me the occasion of meeting him again after, I think, 10 years ago. We met a first time, which was more important for me than probably for you. As has just been said, you have your icons, and he's one of my icons because he can do something that I cannot do really well at all. One is speak coherently in English, and secondly, write coherently in English. Neither of that is very easy, actually. Professor Spence was born in 1936 in Great Britain, trained in Cambridge, and then he switched to Yale in 1959. What's even more interesting, he switched from British European history, as he defines it, to Chinese history. I'm going to ask him why he did that later on, but maybe he'll tell us anyhow. He got his PhD in 1965 in Yale, and was then appointed at Yale to stay there up to now, in various positions, the usual way, assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor since 1971, and then he has these beautiful titles that American professors of some standing have. The last one I like best is Sterling Professor. I'm sure you like it as well. He has written 12 books up to now, and I've brought 6 real books and one kind of book. When you get famous, your articles get collected, and publishers want to make some money off the articles you already published anyhow, and I'm sure they did. The last reward that he got, I'm not going to list them all, it's probably, you wouldn't appreciate me doing it anyhow, but this one is nice, is that you have been made, correct me later on if I'm wrong, in precise phrasing of it, Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George on the Queen's Birthday Honours List of 2001. Actually, that's why you're here. Because the day before we met him yesterday, he had gotten it. And actually, he's not British anymore. I mean, I'm sure he's still British in many ways. And especially the ways that I like best. But in terms of citizenship, he's now an American citizen. In 2000, he became an American citizen. As a historian, he is exceedingly broad, which I like as well. I think when you do Chinese history, you can't just stop in 1911 when the revolution took place, or 1949, or just start in 1949. He basically starts somewhere around 1600 and moves up to the present day. I think the last in the big book, loved by our students, because there are so many factories. I move around. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, that might be the real problem then. He moves throughout this period and he does all kinds of things, but there are some themes that can be discerned. First of all, the biggest theme, I think, in terms of the number of books that you've written is on China in the West, China in the West, the West in China, China in Western eyes. There are quite a lot of books that have that kind of interest. And then there is the social history, or I like to think of it as social history, the death of Woman Wang and some other books as well. And then there's the emperor. You have a strong interest in the emperor in China, especially Qing emperors in this case. I'd love you to have to write a piece on the Jia Jing emperor actually, because that would be fun to see what you make of him. That's a 16th century emperor who has done some interesting things. But you've written on the Kanxi emperor and just now on the Yongzheng emperor, and especially in the Yongzheng case, we share a research interest actually. But you've written on the emperor not as a political institution, but as a person. What makes him tick? Basically, at least that's how I like your work and how I read your work, really. Well, why is this kind of work important? It's easy to find fault with someone who writes so many books. It's easy to find fault with anybody who does research on China, because it's in many ways an underdeveloped field, I think. Anyhow, I'm not sure you agree, but I think it's an underdeveloped field. Most topics you can do for the first time, which is nice because nobody can criticize your work. It's unpleasant because there's nobody to find fault with. It's much easier to find fault with someone than to do something completely new. But the Chinese field is also a very difficult field because there is these Chinese characters which you can't print in Western books, so you have to transcribe them into a kind of system which we call pinyin or Wei Zhaos. In this suit, I don't know if you have had this experience, but then you get the X's and the Q's and ZH, and you don't have a clue how to pronounce it, you don't have a clue how to remember it. In fact, I still cannot remember it. I need the Chinese characters to remember Chinese words because I can't do it from the transcription. So it's really putting people off. And that's where you need people like him who can write proper English and speak it properly, so they can write in such a way that even if you're put off by the transcription of the words, at least you find the story interesting. And there are many stories that you can tell about China, but there are only few people, sadly, who can tell it. Of course, when I say that he deals with a period which is broad in scope, it's not that every book deals with a period from 1600 to, luckily, to 1989 or thereabouts. I mean, he picks his topic, and it seems that there's a kind of switch. He does a recent one, he does a late one, a recent one, a late one. I think, I'm not sure if this is on purpose, but there's a going back and forth. But you never do two books in the same period after each other, at least not in terms of publication, I think. And what is so, except for being nice books to read and books that make you forget you want to find the flaws in it. And I'm the kind of person who always wants to find the flaw in a book. But I forget to do it with his books. And then I read it the second time, I'm sure I'll find some. But it's quite an achievement to write a book that the historian does not want to find the flaw in first. The first wants to read the book and then return to it and make a mess of it. And I've reviewed his books, I'm sure he knows what I mean. But what's nice about his books too is that they look at China on the basis of sources that other historians often don't use. He has used ghost stories. He has not used pornography yet. He might. It's an interesting source. And has great pictures. But I think all other sources you have used. You have local histories. You have used a manual for the magistrate. which has been translated into English, but lots of parts were left out actually in the translation. And you have used enormous amounts of archives, Western sources. You have used the Bible that was used by God's Chinese son. I think that's one of the best titles in Chinese scholarship that I've ever seen, God's Chinese son, about the Taiping rebellion in the mid-19th century, and a guy who claimed that he was a reincarnation of the younger brother, of course, of Jesus. And to make, I mean, you could have called the book The Younger Brother of Jesus, but that doesn't sound very well. To make the Chinese son out of it, I think was great. It's hard. I don't know how they did they translate that into Dutch? You wouldn't know. God's enige zoon. Doesn't sound as well. Anyhow, you combine all kinds of sources with all kinds of different perspectives. And having done that, trying to do that myself, I know how difficult it actually is, because these sources don't fit on each other. Ghost stories are written with a completely different perspective than a local gazetteer, which has all kinds of different perspectives in it as well. An archive is produced for the emperor, so it has to please the emperor. The local gazetteer has to please local elites, completely different. A ghost story has to please the ear when it is read, and the eye when it's read to you, the ear, and when it's read, the eye. I mean, there's completely different aesthetics and therefore completely different demands on the prose, on the contents, on the structure of the text. And when you want to fit them all into one narrative, it's really rather difficult. So one of the things I'd like to ask Professor Spence is how he does it. I'm sure I can't imitate it, but maybe I learned something there. And then when you bring it to a point, what it is about, what he does is not just finding sources. That's relatively easy. You go into a Chinese library and you check out the books that have not yet been checked out before, and you'll probably find a source that not so many people have used before. It's not even that difficult to read it. I mean, there are 1.2 million, what is that in English? 1.2 billion Chinese, and surely a few tens of millions can read some classical Chinese, and surely a few millions can read pretty good classical Chinese. So it's not a question of there being enough people to do it. But the problem is putting it together and asking the right questions. And he asked very interesting questions. I've got that book. The book that his latest, I don't know, I'm sure you didn't use this edition, but the Da Yi Jue Mi Lu. This is a dialogue, a constructed dialogue, obviously, between a guy that was caught, and he describes the reason by the book how he was caught and why he was caught, and the emperor. And this guy wants to basically overthrow the emperor. It's a rather weird story, and the weirdest is that the emperor doesn't get him killed. And this is not an emperor who had any problems with killing people, or rather having them killed. And there's great suspicion that he got his father killed, or got his brothers killed, and although on the other hand he had someone imprisoned who accidentally had a brother killed. But anyhow, this is not a guy who has any compunction in killing people. Yet this guy who wants to overthrow him, even though it was a feeble plot, I mean, it was something that normally gets you executed, beheaded, I mean, which is much worse than being strangled. I mean, the worst punishment possible, except for slowly cutting someone apart. He didn't do that. It's only after the emperor dies that his son has the man executed after all. And that's what the book is about. But this is one source which actually nobody, well, people had studied it before, but not in the way that he does it. And that's probably what characterizes Professor Spence, that he takes up these sources, sometimes very unlikely sources nobody has looked at before. He reads them. All of that is easy to read them, but then make a story out of it, and then a story that people want to read, spend a few bucks on to buy the book, and so on and so forth. So at this point, I would like to give the floor to Professor Spence, and let him tell us what makes him tick.
Sorry? Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Tehar for that introduction. I know that when we come to the discussion, we're probably going to look at some flaws, because that is his mode. And he's very good at finding flaws. So he's been gracious in stage one, I believe. I'd like to thank you all for coming and somebody for choosing this spectacular space. It's the nicest room I think I've ever talked in. And so I guess the pianos are brought all the way up here, right, in that splendid elevator. I'd like to thank Monique Knappen, who brought me here, and the supporters of John Adams Society, and all the others. I know an operation like this takes a lot of logistics, so thank you for having me. And we'll try and share our thoughts in the general discussion with you. I've been given 35 minutes. You run very tight schedule here in Amsterdam. Well, I'd like to have much more discussion, and then Barend can join in as well. So, and I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Zürcher, who is one of the world's great sinologists, and just to mention that you might be happy to know that in the United States now and in all sorts of areas, the Dutch expertise in sinology is deeply admired. I don't know if everybody knows that, but it's a great tradition, and it goes back, well, certainly into the mid-19th century, and one can find many fine figures earlier. And the Dutch were, of course, among the very first to send a highly watchful and intelligent embassy to the early Qing court in the 17th century. So this record and the continuation of it in our present time in universities in the Netherlands is very exciting. Professor Zürcher is somebody who's changed the field dramatically, particularly for the studies of Chinese Buddhism, and now in his studies of Christianity in China and the missionary enterprises. Now the purpose here, I think, is mainly to talk about the Dutch edition, which we have some copies of over there. And I think the Dutch publishers have been among my loyalist translators. They have definitely been the most meticulous. Working from the English language with a good Dutch translator is a formidable experience. You will get messages, airmail, saying things like, "Dear Professor Spence, on page 17 you pointed out so-and-so, but on page 309 you seem to contradict yourself. I wonder if you could possibly explain, since we are soon going to press." And if this is a book you wrote maybe 6 years before, you try and even find the notes, let alone make sense of this always accurate comment. I won't go into others unless you want to in discussion, but I have great respect for translators, and I believe the translator of Treason by the book is here, or Monique thought he might be able to come. Well, I'd love to meet you later if you are here, and others who've worked on earlier books. Now, let me just talk then about this book. I have the English language paperback here, in fact, the American edition of the English language paperback, and the Dutch edition is over here. This is a book about the early, well, in the simplest way, it's a book about the early 18th century in China. It was a period I hadn't really looked at before in detail, and as Professor Tehar mentioned, I do like to try and find some strong source base, and if it hasn't been used too much, so much the better, and trying to make sense of it. And I guess you would say that scholars of China, fairly recent Chinese history, would have known that there was a very unusual case in the 1720s, which involved a kind of a treasonous plot against the emperor. And again, like other scholars, I'd sort of known this, but hadn't thought of doing very much about it till it slowly struck me as more and more strange, and I began to find more sources and realize how well it had been studied. So we have here an early 18th century story. It focuses on a world of imperial power, which again, as Professor Tehara mentioned, has interested me from my very first graduate work when I switched into Chinese studies. We don't need, I think, many details. Maybe I could add to his cheerful summary of my work that I have various theories about academic writing. One is that I do not see why research cannot be made available to the general public. I see absolutely no reason for it to be shrouded in arcane almost like guild-like protection mechanism. And so trying to make sense of a story, and maybe in some ways more like a storyteller than a professional historian perhaps, try and see which names, which incidents, which people, which moments catch the story most effectively. In other words, try and cut your way through details. Some historians like to simply build detail on detail on detail, and that for specialists can be fascinating. I think my tendency is to try and cut through the detail if I can, having at least tried to master a good deal of it, and see what the basic story is. So this treason case, it was clear, was a story about imperial power, and it was a very special kind of imperial power, which we have to spend just a few moments on to understand the book. Because in 1644, really about the only date we probably need have for this talk, in 1644, China's last indigenous Chinese dynasty was overthrown. It was the famous Ming dynasty, maker of the great blue and white porcelain that probably many of you have seen around the world. A time of great cultural, very stylish, artistic period, and a fascinating dynasty in its own right. But in 1644, the Ming were overthrown. Other dynasties have been overthrown in the past. Indeed, this had happened maybe 20 or more times. But in this case, as only once before, so dramatically, the Ming were overthrown by people from the outside, who they had often considered barbarians, or used a word that could be translated in that direction. We like to say others nowadays, fashionably, but they were overthrown by others from outside, who had a good deal of experience of Chinese culture and had thought about conquering China for some time. And these were the Manchus, as they've usually been called, and as they began to call themselves in the 17th century. They were actually from Jurchen tribes in the northeastern regions beyond China proper, as it was then known. And of course, in the 19th century, 18th, the West began to use the word Manchuria for this region. Manchu, though we might discuss this with Professor Tehar, as far as I know, nobody has satisfactorily found out exactly what this strange term meant. It might have a religious origin, it might have some other kind of confederation origin. But the Manchus in 1644 sent their troops into China from the north, across that famous northern frontier, through the pass where the Great Wall runs down to the sea, just below the Korean frontier. And within about 2 years of absolutely extraordinary military campaigning, they overran the country. They overran China, forced the Ming into exile or death, and established a new regime, which lasted until 1912, when the last emperor abdicated. And I think probably one of the most watched films about China in the last century was The Last Emperor, which deals with Henry Puyi. Did anyone here see that? A fascinating film, Bertolucci, I think. Sometimes excellent film, particularly I think about some of the symbolism of the late Qing. And so that was the last dynasty. And China after that plunged into a period of protracted warfare, about which I've written elsewhere. But we need to know this. We need to know that China was conquered by the other, because it aroused intense and extraordinary emotions. And perhaps the only near parallels had been several hundred years before, when the Mongols overthrew the Sung dynasty. And again, the shock of the inner heartland of Chinese culture being overwhelmed by Mongol cavalry, with an inconceivably different governmental system and a highly complicated body of their own traditions. The way that this not very large group could overthrow the great armies of the Sung and the complex politics of this, that was something the Chinese knew about from an earlier period, from the 13th century. And now they had to, in some cases, relive it. They had, so the background to this is something I knew as a historian, but wanted to share with the reader. It's something to do with a sense of loss, combined with a sense of shame. How could you lose your country? What did it mean in this context? And worse than that, were you actually losing your culture? Or were you somehow able to re-grasp it? Could you somehow get hold of an earlier Chinese something that had seemed to be overthrown? Now it's hard to get this in a short span. We can certainly talk more about it later in discussion. But in the 17th century and early 18th in China, there were a lot of people, again to use another cliche perhaps, who were soul searching, or they were searching for meanings about their own culture. And they tried to work out why they had lost. The Ming was, after all, a great society. Why was it overthrown by Manchus? The numbers were very disturbing. Something I think perhaps historians don't mention enough. There were certainly less than 1 million Manchus. And that probably combined, most of those figures combined children at least, and perhaps the women as well in the Manchu confederations. Great scholars like Fang Jiaoying, many of us would know, and revere, he was one of my teachers, tried to work out how many Manchus had been. And he couldn't get, in terms of active military forces, beyond, I think, about 400,000, something like that, but probably less. China's population was certainly in the region of 120 million. So there's an obvious military disparity here, a population disparity. Why does this happen in history? Obviously partly because many Chinese chose to fight with the Manchus. And the reasons for doing that were highly complicated. They could be career decisions, ambitious people switched sides. They could be because sometimes they were compelled to, sometimes there was a hostage situation really. You fight for us or you lose your son, for instance. Other civilizations have done something like that in time. There were those who were living in Manchuria. There were many Chinese who were colonists in the area, or settlers, and they really almost had to join, although they were Chinese in essence, but they became Manchu by adoption. And the Manchus were very skillful in drawing these groups together. Then there was disillusion, obviously, with the Ming regime and the way it had behaved. Again, a historian looking at the outside sees the Ming as being a often ineffective centralized government, particularly from the 16th and into the early 17th century. So people who survived this conquest saw or sought a kind of a moral reason for this, and they thought perhaps the whole system of values in the nation had gone awry. Things had gone wrong somewhere at the heart of the culture. And so there was much searching within philosophy and in political theory for the way the country had lost its bearings, I think we could say with some accuracy. What struck me as extraordinary is that all this, or much of this, took place in 1644, and in 1728, when the case began, you could say it was almost as alive as ever for many people. I don't know how many of these, the world is full of such rancors and conquests and losses, of course, and we see them all the time, we read about them all the time. But for over 80 years, to keep these flames of hatred alive and keep the moral quest for your failure alive is perhaps unusual, though we can probably find examples in discussion. But in the 1720s, this issue was still very much alive. And as time had gone by, the issue had become alive to people who had been born after 1644. It's much more logical for those who saw the loss, but for those who inherited a sense of the loss, that's very different. So we get what some people have called maybe a rather ponderous phrase, something like reconstructed or reconstituted ethnic hatreds, or reconstruction of somebody else's experience. And the emperors knew this at some level. They knew that the Manchus were often not trusted by the Chinese, or were disliked in a complicated way, even though these emperors saw themselves as being good rulers. And that's something I'd particularly perhaps like to talk to Professor Tahar about in the beginning of our discussion. Because the Manchus, I feel, tried to rule China well. And they were extremely conscientious, and they worked extremely long hours at this. These were not emperors kind of sequestered in the inner palace with the ladies, of whom there were many in that system. They were hard-working paper pushers. They did a terrific amount of work trying to organize the country and keep it structured. And so that is part of our background too. The only Chinese name, perhaps, or maybe one other we'll need, would be the emperor who was ruling at the time of this treason case. He, as Tahara mentioned, his name was Emperor Yongjung, and he ruled China from 1723 to 1735. Yongjung, whose picture is on the front of the Dutch edition, you'll see a rather unusual picture. We can talk about that again in discussion. It's a reconstituted portrait of the emperor in the guise of a kind of Central Asian magus, I think, in a way. Or just, but you'll see that unusual picture. He had this emperor, the Manchu emperor, had himself painted in many guises, like other monarchs have done in history. But so that is definitely his face, his canny face. And in the American edition, we use this picture of his face. A very intelligent, shrewd man with a thin moustache and quite witty eyes, and just a subtle man. And as Professor Tahara has shown in his own research recently, an extremely committed follower of Buddhist religion, and somebody who knew this at I think a very considerably deep level. Somebody who was a good scholar of Chinese, of course knew Manchu, but had inherited his position, was the third Manchu to rule China since the conquest of 1644. So we have this clever and calculating ruler trying to strengthen the hold of his imperial family over Chinese people who are still somewhat restive. A few other things then, and then I'll read a little bit and have a little discussion, then we'll open things up. The emperor, I think we also must say, was a moralist, and we can perhaps debate a little bit what this means. He certainly did a lot of moral posturing. He liked to be seen as having a certain kind of moral stance, and he wanted, perhaps all the more because he knew some people distrusted him, he wanted to be seen as a virtuous man. It was true that there'd been a bitter struggle for succession in China in the 1700s when he became a teenager, and that struggle for succession against his father, who's a very powerful ruler indeed, that had sort of poisoned court politics. The man who became Yongjung was the fourth surviving son of the old emperor. The Chinese did not necessarily follow primogeniture, by the way, at all for the men. It was often the most talented who could be chosen. This was more common under the Manchus because of their confederation background. But Yongjung, when he became emperor, never could shake off the rumors that perhaps he shouldn't have been emperor. In other words, was he a usurper or was he not? We can debate that again. The question has not been solved, to give you the short answer. But he was very aware that people thought he might be a usurper, and he didn't like this, so it made him more moralistic. It also didn't help keep all his brothers alive. And the fact that some of his brothers died rather surprisingly in the peak of health speeded his arrival on the throne and of course increased the rumors against him. Then how do we know about this? Since Professor Tahara has raised this question, I'd like to mention just a moment so the people who want to discuss it can have some bearings. How do we know about it? Partly because, as he said, we actually have a book, which I'll come back to in a few moments, a Chinese book published in late 1729. The other thing is that we have the record, the documentary record, of the debates behind this particular treason case in 1728 and 29 through the extraordinary archival collections in China, which are split, for those of you who remember the Civil War of the 1940s in China. These archives are split between Taiwan and the mainland, because when Chiang Kai-shek or Chiang Kai-shek left China in 1948 to retreat to Taiwan, he did a very interesting thing. He took as many archives as he could. I see this as thoroughly traditional in the Chinese context. if you could control the past, you might control the future. And though the present was uncertain in 1948 and 1949, as Mao took over with the communists, the presence of archives in Taiwan gave a kind of solidity to the regime. And as a graduate student, having worked with Mr. Fang Jiaoying on text, it was to Taiwan that I went actually to do my first research, because many of the 17th century archives were held in what was not yet the Palace Museum in Taiwan. And China was then racked by the Great Leap Forward. It was simply impossible to get there from either the States, or completely impossible from the United States, and extremely difficult from Europe by then. So there is an enormous backlog of sources, and for some of you interested in that side of history, I think we both enjoy talking about that. Again, Professor Tehara has been looking at some fascinating Buddhist sources. Now, what happened? How does one start to tell a story? So I'll lead you a little bit into that. What happened was that in the city of Xi'an, which some of you may have visited, where the great terracotta warrior tombs have been discovered, one of the heartlands of early Chinese civilization, the early city of Chang'an is almost the same area as the present Xi'an. In October 1728, something happened which, to me, starts the story. So I'll just read you a little bit, since Monique asked me to just read perhaps a tiny bit. This is from, of course, the original English. It's probably all the more elegant in Dutch. We can talk about that with the translator later. As Professor Tehara mentioned, I do like to seize a moment that captures the story. And I should add, perhaps, since he's raised the difficulty of how you do tell a historical story, that though the details here may seem surprisingly precise, they have been kept within the documentary record, that one can work out where people were standing and what their gestures were, and when they did what, even what their expressions were, because there were a multiplicity of secret reports about the same action flowing into the emperor as center of this information network. And again, I enjoy talking about that, and I know Professor Tehara does, because this question of information flow is very central to the power of the Chinese emperor. And Yongjong, as emperor, was a master at information flow. And so within a few moments of what I'm now going to read, within 2 days, 3 separate top secret accounts of the same thing were raced to Beijing by special courier, horseback courier, by 3 different, very, very senior officials, none of whom knew what the other one was saying, and all 3 were read by the emperor alone. So the emperor had a triangulation over data that, of course, none of the individuals could have. So for the historian, that's wonderful. And these are, in fact, this particular groups, 2 of them are preserved in mainland China, in the Beijing #1 archive, and one of them is preserved in Taiwan, in Taipei. So it's a sort of, it shows us how this historical record has been protected. Okay, let me just then set you off with the prologue. If you can just take yourself back to October 78, okay? And you're in the city of Xi'an. And I call this prologue, I just called it the letter. So imagine yourself writing or receiving a letter. The man holding the letter stands by the side of the road at the foot of the drum tower, gazing down the long avenue that stretches straight through the city of Xi'an to the closely guarded west gate a mile away. To his left, the view is blocked by lofty walls, those of the spacious compound that serves as office and residence to the Governor General of the Western Provinces. That is why the man has chosen this spot to wait. He knows that Yue Jun-qi, the current Governor General of the region, is attending an official reception at one of the pavilions out in the suburbs beyond Westgate, and will be returning down this road to his compound as soon as the morning ceremony is over. That will be the time to act. It is almost noon when at last General Yue's sedan chair, with its accompanying retinue of bearers and outriders, can be seen making its way back along West Street. The man waits until they are almost opposite the drum tower before running towards them across the road, brandishing his letter in the air. And instinctively, Yue's retainers shout at the man to stop, and they form a protective ring around the general to block this stranger from approaching any closer. From the seat of his sedan chair, General Yue stares out at the scene. This stranger is not dressed like the ordinary government underlings and office clerks, bustling around with correspondence for their superiors, with whom the general so often conducts his business. Nor does this man act like them. There is something unusual about his demeanor. Without leaving his chair, General Yue makes a decision. He calls out to his retainers to bring him the letter that the man is clutching. They do so, and General Yue glances at the envelope. A single look is all he needs to realize that he is in serious trouble. If this were an official letter dealing with some detail of government, it would address him by his full name and title as Governor General of the provinces of Shanxi and Sichuan, or perhaps Commanding General of the Western Armies. But this letter is addressed to the Commander-in-Chief deputed by heaven. In suspicious times, such as those that General Yue lives in, such a superscription is itself a danger sign. Ordering the retainers to arrest the stranger and to hold him for questioning, Yue goes to his office and tells the staff there to leave him undisturbed. When they are all gone, he opens the envelope and begins to read. On the opening page, the writer of this letter identifies himself not with a name, but with a mysterious title, Summer Calm, the leaderless wanderer of the southern seas. The writer further states that the messenger who will be delivering this letter to the general is named Zhang the Luminous. As to the letter itself, everything is as General Yue has guessed and feared. A few lines to suffice to show him that the contents are undiluted treason. Now, to me, that was just a fascinating moment, that this unknown letter writer with an unknown letter is received by a general. It has what I love about history. It has a lot of contingency in it, and I find that, in fact, a couple of books I've written have depended on a gesture. In this case, a gesture probably many of us would have made. We could either have gone like this, or we could have gone like that. The general had a reception all morning. Those of you who've had receptions in China might believe his guard was slightly down. Probably 4 hours of partying before lunchtime, and so maybe that's why he went like that, give the guy a chance, we don't know. But his guard was put up again immediately he saw, and the trouble was everybody had seen him receive the letter, so the story was out, although nothing was known about the content except in that one brain, and he could perhaps have torn it up, because so many people in his own entourage had seen him receive the letter. And then having sent the staff out of the office, why had he wanted to read an official letter in private when usually his secretaries would have been around and his staff? So he'd made two decisions in a split moment, both of which were very human, but they got him firmly enmeshed in the story. Now for the last 5 minutes that I think I'm believed, I'm allowed under your austere Dutch schedule, I'll just mention some of the things that were going on, and then you can follow up, or with Tahar we can perhaps discuss several of them. Anyway, it is because of this moment and this letter that the emperor hears about the case. As I said, really from 3 senior people, none of whom can afford not to tell him, if that's not too many double negatives. You're now all in a situation, if you're a close comrade in arms of this general, you've still got to report it. Maybe something strange is going on, because if you don't, you're party to something if something wrong is going on. So within a few hours, in fact, the emperor starts to question this messenger, and he uses torture, and he nearly kills the messenger. and I mean the torture nearly kills the messenger. And they realize that this messenger is not going to tell them very much, so they use trickery, various kinds, which I can discuss with you. And they finally get an interrogation that leads to a naming of names, and particularly who is this mysterious teacher whose words are being reported in this letter. The letter we know from its contents because they are summarized in various places, but we do not have every single word of the original letter. We can rebuild a lot of it from the Da Yi Jue Mi Lu, this book, which I translated as Escape from Delusion, or Rescuing the Self from the World of Delusion. Return, the book really means return to reality, coming back to earth in a sense. We can tell that the letter included the following things. It used extremely violent language against the emperor. It discussed his usurpation of the throne. It took it for granted, indeed, and gave a lot of background detail on the usurpation. It talked of the emperor's greed, particularly his greed for money. It talked about his unusual cruelty to his brothers and the fact that he'd murdered some of them. And it talked about his lust, sexual lust, and improper behavior in many occasions, and gave considerable details about what was wrong with the court. So the letter itself, at first the general wouldn't send the letter to the emperor because he said its contents were so vile that he couldn't send it. It was not correct for a senior general to send a letter like this to the emperor of China. And so he didn't dare keep it. So one of the myriad details in the story is that he sealed it in a container and then gave it to the governor of the province to keep sealed in his office. So the general kind of got rid of it, but also sealed it so no one else could read it, but he no longer had it. And when the emperor got this rather complicated message, summarizing very briefly the letter and saying, "I'm not sending it to you," the emperor immediately wrote back by express courier and said, "I want this right away. Send it. I don't care what it says. I want to read it. Otherwise this is all kind of shadow play." So the letter was raced to Beijing and was read by the emperor. And in the meantime, and I'll only use a phrase now, but we can say the security net fanned out across many regions of China. It seemed like an enormous plot was underway to get troops to mutiny and turn the armies of Western China and march east towards Beijing, seize the capital, and either re-establish the old Ming. Remember, 80 years later after its fall, or perhaps to establish some new kind of regime that would make a better China. There was something like this in the air. The emperor coordinated, and this is when my whole interest in this story began to switch to a fascination with police methodology. It switched to an extremely thorough, I guess we would call it dragnet, in which every suspect's name was registered, and then every single suspect was arrested in his home by groups of local authorities, militia and regular troops, operating in each case under the guidance of a special commissioner appointed by the emperor in Beijing, and then sent to different parts of China. All this done in a few weeks. In countryside alive with gossip, where any troop moving anywhere would be seen immediately. In every single case, each suspect was caught with no slip-ups, often at a distance of 1,500 miles or so. All their relatives were arrested. All incriminating documents were read, and they found out to arrest other people like this. The numbers were not anything like as huge as they feared, and they actually became slowly smaller and smaller. And then finally they decided they had a list of about 14 or 15 prime suspects. They had the leader himself, a man called Zheng Jing, who we can talk about later, who was himself a school teacher, who had done poorly in China's great state examination system. So we could say he was a frustrated scholar who was now a village school teacher, and who had sought to use history as a means, as a mobilization device, to overthrow the emperor and perhaps to get power for himself. But this was, I think, in any culture would be seen as a formidable police operation, and involving extraordinary logistical skills, and a lot of people who kept their mouths shut, and led to a series of interrogations in China, which slowly enabled them to pick up a picture in which the guilt of everybody involved was made totally clear. And at that point, as Professor Terhar mentioned a little bit, you would expect the simplest thing to do was simply to execute, by whatever means you chose, the leader of this conspiracy. Well, everything I've said now is only really the first part, maybe the first 3 chapters of the book. The rest is about what the emperor did. And let me just mention that, and then we can pursue whichever bits you want. What the emperor did was, in 1729, he summoned the suspects. They were all, by this time, they'd been interrogated again and again, and some of them were not in particularly good shape, perhaps. The plot had already spread to, they'd found more names, and the names had included the names of many people who were dead and had been buried, in one case, about 45 years before. And so it became a quest to reinterrogate the living and also to disinter the dead, and to find written records wherever they went, and to decide how to handle the living conspirators, which was somewhat different from the problem of handling the dead conspirators. The emperor spent the summer, to my great surprise, questioning the chief conspirator, the school teacher, who was from Hunan province in the south. In fact, if anybody wants to pursue this, very, very close to the region where Mao Zedong, had his first guerrilla camp in Jinggangshan. In fact, you can see the mountains of Jinggangshan from the hometown of the school teacher, Zheng Jing, because I was lucky enough to get there. I love to see the country I'm talking about, even if it's changed, which the countryside does. But this was very much linked to that area. And the emperor discussed through the summer, discussed with the teacher, with intermediaries, why had he said what he said about throne. And the emperor tried to instill in him an understanding of how Chinese government worked. And again, that's something we could come back to if you'd like to. The emperor came to the feeling, or stated the public feeling, that this man had acted in this treasonous way and had insulted the throne and sought to overthrow the throne because he simply didn't understand how complicated government was. And he developed what you might call a defense argument, which is that you try being emperor before you criticize emperors. As I mentioned, a population of close to 200 million by this time. The population was rising, very much the geography of China today. Plus, then Taiwan was recently in the empire. What we call the far west of China was not yet, but otherwise it's very much the same area. So the emperor taught. He actually ran a seminar in which he sent documents of government to the chief conspirator in his jail cell, made him read them through, and then report what he'd learned from them. And these included highly confidential documents about very complex financial, legal, and other matters. By the end of the summer of 1729, the emperor felt that this procedure had been quite successful because the school teacher had written what I guess now we would call abject recantations of various kinds, but had shown to the emperor the satisfactory sense that he had been in the wrong because of ignorance, which of course is what the emperor wanted to hear, and the school teacher was a practical man in some senses, so he may have sort of got the message, as we say. But he began to write out. In fact, he was ordered not just to say his recantation, but to begin writing it all out. And these recantations were filed and assembled in the court by the scribe. At this point, the bureaucracy got irritated and said that guilt was proved 100 times, so why didn't they just kill the man and get on with it? Very much the Professor Tahar approach to justice. No, the way he went like that. The bureaucracy felt exactly the same. The bureaucracy said, this is high treason, it's totally proven, we kill the man. I mean, that's what societies do in general. At some stage, unless they go through a very long prison sentence. What the emperor did is what I'll close with, because it's the most surprising thing of all. He rejected 3 separate, highly coordinated requests by the senior bureaucrats in China to execute this man. Now the guilt was overwhelmingly proven. The emperor said he had decided that, in fact, letting the man go would be a more important act of justice, more effective than executing him. Because if this was a question of legal procedure and compassion, then what better compassion than to have somebody proven completely guilty and then release them? And so in what to me was, even though I knew something about the background of this case, was perhaps the biggest surprises of all, which is completely proven by the existing documents of the time. The emperor did a whole lot of things in late 1729 and early 1730. One, he ordered the man pardoned and rejected the final appeals from the senior bureaucracy that they kill him. He said, and he then said, this will no longer be discussed. This is off the agenda of national polity. The man is pardoned. He then ordered the publication of the transcripts of the interrogations in Beijing and the exchange, the so-called seminars, what I call seminar, a summary of the treasonous letter, the proceedings that had led General Yue to do what he did, and a summary of the court debates. He included the teacher's recantation, and then in the end he included a much longer, formal recantation called My Return to the Good, Gui Ren Lu, My Return to the Virtuous Means of Conduct. This book was published and distributed all over China at the cost of the court, with every senior local official ordered to make another 100 copies from the copy that he got from the court, by using the copy he got to make printing blocks for a new 100 copies, which would then circulate across the country. In the local communities, when each of them got that copy, they were to make 100 more copies. I'm very bad at mathematics, but you can get the general idea. There must have been several 100,000 copies around, probably done at minimal cost within about 2 years. He then gave the conspirator a job, discussed the salary, and sent him back to Hunan so that he could be a regularly employed member of society. Then, which I hadn't expected at all, even less than any of the other, he gave him a large cash grant so that of 1,000 ounces of silver, a huge sum in those days, so he could buy land and re-establish himself as a member of the gentry classes. And that was how, when the emperor died, matters still stood. 7 years after the treason case had erupted on the landscape. So it's really, the book became a study of sort of police method and the complexities of defining compassion, and perhaps the ways that this are mixed with hypocrisy or realpolitik in different levels, and also the way that the Manchus showed considerable imagination, I think, imaginativeness in trying to clear themselves of charges which, even though they were 80 years old, still could make emperors really tremble. Thank you.
You have your pile there. I sit next to my pile. Nothing important.
The pile collapsed.
Well, you suggested many questions that I could ask to you. I think I've asked them now, so you should start replying them yourself, I suppose. But what is when you talk about this Yongzheng emperor, and you know, I looked from a Buddhist source, and in this Buddhist source you also get a kind of picture of this emperor being a real Buddhist, not just putting up a brave face for political reasons to address an audience of lay Buddhists, but really going deep into the matter, understanding quite a lot. I mean, he may not have been a Buddhist philosopher, innovative, but he really understood things. And he talked to some of the cleverest Buddhists of his day, actually also Buddhists who love beating each other up. I mean, these Chan abbots usually got beaten as part of their education, so it was not the peaceful Buddhism that you may think of. I mean, it was a very paternalistic kind of Buddhism. But still, I mean, it's what at the time was called Buddhism, what we would call Buddhism now. So he was sincere in that. Would you think he was sincere in his dealing with the Zhengjing?
Yes, I've thought about this a lot, and obviously there's kind of a lot of manipulation in this story, and I read, at least as I read through these documents, I do see the emperor kind of changing his stance. At first he's simply scared and worried, like a powerful man who thinks there's a conspiracy. And then he's interested in knowing exactly what happened, which is what a good administrator would want, I think. And then as he becomes aware that this is not life-threatening, it's not even throne-threatening, really, that these people are maybe not very effective conspirators, I think he becomes more potentially merciful. In other words, had these people really been dangerous, I think he would have killed them without compunction. But that remains a kind of hypothesis. As I think you mentioned very quickly in the opening remarks, this emperor could certainly kill people without compunction at other times. But something about these scholars and their followers interested him. There are many sub-themes that are like the Lu Liu Liang. There are many other sub-themes that perhaps we can't get into here, but it turned out that this teacher, this school teacher in Hunan province, had been reading the works of a much more distinguished protester against the Manchu conquest, who had actually lived through it and had died in the 1680s. And one thing the emperor's police discovered for the emperor was that these books were being hidden and copied and read and reread 70 or 80 years later by a kind of underground group of readers, like a room like this in modern society. The underground readers who keep track of things, who run the risk of death by keeping these texts, which have been totally banned by the state. And I think the emperor was startled how much the text was the enemy, if I may put it like that. And you may argue, I think one could argue, that's a very Chinese approach. It was the text was the enemy, maybe more than living humans. And so it became a hunt for textual evidence, and a good deal of the book deals with that in one way or another. The other side, which I didn't mention before, is that the emperor, and I don't think this would really relate to the Buddhist side, it would relate to the commonsensical side of being a powerful person. The emperor realized that much of this case was actually about rumor and innuendo. It was the way that people pass from to each other denigratory stories about the powerful, and how these stories get a kind of logic in the local community that it's very, very hard for the centralized power to get rid of. And so much of the emperor's quest, and I do discuss this in really two different chapters of the book, the emperor's quest became not only for the guilt of the conspirators and those who'd written dangerous texts and had hidden them, but he also became fascinated in how rumors spread. And that actually changed the direction of my own book, because I think that's a fascinating area. Why does a rumor spread, and why do we believe it? I'm sure all of us have believed rumors on no foundation at all, sometimes extraordinarily important ones about politics or life and death. Something about them makes them convincing. The emperor found that people believed the wildest rumors about himself, and he then formulated something that actually led him in a way to be merciful, but I don't think it's Buddhist. But the proposition he came to in late 1729 was that, well, there were two linked propositions. One, every rumor has a human source, was premise number one. If you go after the person who you know spread the rumor and find who that person heard the rumor from, eventually you'll find the source of the rumor. And some of the most extraordinary police work, as we might call it, was getting a person who'd spread a rumor in, say, 1727, interrogating them, finding that they'd heard this from a medicine peddler in 1725, finding which town the medicine peddler had been in, sending police to that town, finding the person the medicine peddler said had told him the story, the junior military officer, finding the junior military officer's name, going to the town or the barracks where that man was, arresting him, finding he had got it from a physiognomist, one of the people who reads your thing, sending it. I was dazed by this, by the complexity of it, and finally saying, gotcha. In one case, number 6 in this chain, got you. Now a late middle-aged man. So, is that compassion, or is it sort of maniacal police? Is it sort of an almost insane thoroughness? Or is it right that rumors can always be traced to their source if you're thorough enough?
Well, maybe given time, given the tight schedule that's been spoken about, or you're getting even now, it's time to open the floor and that we talk a bit less, or at least I talk a bit less. Maybe there are people who want to ask questions themselves. They may not have read this book yet, because it's out only recently, but maybe on something else, or
yes,
something that has been talked about.
That's fine. And please ask questions in Dutch.
And I can translate it into English, and everybody knows how bad my English is.
If somebody would rather do it that way, that seems fine too. Is that permitted?
No
yes,
sinologists here?
Yes, John Adams would have allowed that.
Please.
I would like to ask a question about Treason and the book. when I read the book, I sometimes wondered, people think a lot about Young Zheng, the common man in China, but what exactly did Young Zheng himself know about the life of the common man? How isolated was he from the life of common people? What did he really know about him, or was he misled by his officials, and so on and so on? Do you have any idea of that?
That's actually a wonderful question. I'll try and keep short, and then I'd love to hear Professor Terhar's answer. What did the emperor really know about the common life of the common person? I think for most emperors, this why it's such a good question is that knowledge was pretty limited, and came from. It doesn't mean their knowledge of human nature was limited, but their knowledge of what it was really like out there in the fields and so on. Was probably fairly thin. This Emperor Yongjung, though he travelled as a young man, because his father made a number of tours around the country, 6 famous southern tours, which come into your research too. But even, on such an imperial tour, you're not really likely to see the common man, because even if you get to a poor area, probably the officials are going to remove the poor people, something we're very familiar with in our own cities, if there's going to be a royal parade or progress, whatever, even a political visit. We purge our streets, I think. And I don't think people would have left famine victims lying around when the emperor was coming by. And those who entertained the emperor did so on an extraordinary scale. These emperors didn't just get a little guest shed. They had palaces prepared, and they traveled with their retainers. We do know that on these tours, they did occasionally summon people and say, come and tell me about life. But there would probably be a watchful official there, and so even a farmer might be a little careful about talking about tax gripes or problems with irrigation and so on. So I think the emperor's view would be through a bureaucratic lens, though his father would have known more than he did. But as a prince, he probably knew something about it. His son also went on tours, but was had an even grander persona. I think, as in many societies of this kind, one of the areas where research is extremely difficult, but is that probably some sense of a more common life might have come through wet nurses and women in the palace, and particularly those who helped raise the child emperors. Who could sometimes come from commoner families, staff, people working, the cooks and so on. Yongjung's mother was actually, I suppose, the equivalent of a chambermaid. In the genealogies, she does not feature, anywhere in those with an official title, and she's just described as a maid. Now, whether this meant that as a mother she was rather more down to earth than others, I have absolutely no. It's just a wild hypothesis. But people, other worlds did impinge on the royal one occasionally. But as perhaps Professor Terhar could tell us a little bit about the impact that might come from Buddhists trained in a completely different monastery. He's been doing original research on this right now. So perhaps you could tell us: does the contact with Buddhist clerics perhaps give this Emperor Yongjung a little more sense of another world than he might have had as an emperor?
Well, there's a paradox there. This guy basically never left the city of Peking. And if he did, he did this in the company of all kinds of people who prevented him from seeing anything. On the other hand, he has personal friends, or at least as far as you can guess from the text. These were his personal friends with which lived in the monastery next to his princely residence outside Peking. And he had very intimate talks about Buddhism and undoubtedly all kinds of things. And he met these guys on a regular basis, and sometimes they even stayed in his palace. And since these monks went back and forth from Peking to their local monasteries in Hangzhou or elsewhere on the Yangtze River, near the Yangtze River, and there suffered sometimes death by hunger. Some of these abbots that he knew, had known in Peking, later died of a famine in Hangzhou. Right? So and their pupils then became abbots again in this monastery in Peking as well as later. And so they switched back to and forth. They had concrete experience with real life as implied in your question. So he might have known, not from personal experience, but from listening to other people. And like you talk about with the Kangxi Emperor, that he also talked to the Jesuits,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And they were also a source of, an unlikely source of information, but a source of information nevertheless. More questions, please. This is your chance. Yes, Oliver. Yeah. Yes. It's okay.
One of the things I've read about prison something interesting is the circulation very extensive and I wonder if I'm not going to ask something I'll ask myself when I read the book. But I wonder if there's any documents about from emotional capacity in that
Yes, thank you for that. As far as I could find out, the emperor never actually met face to face. So the interviews were conducted through. I think I was able to find the intermediary who went from the palace to the prison, and with these documents. In fact, I know it was a particular Manchu aristocrat from the ruling house. So it was sort of intense in terms of writing. I don't think the two men ever eyeballed each other. What was sort of strange that I didn't really know as author or historian what to make of it is that these two men are exactly the same age, and I found that very poignant. They were both at this time of the trial. They were both about 47 or something like this. And they within a few weeks, the failed school teacher and the son of heaven were at the same moment in their lifespan, and so this might have sort of linked them in some way. The emperor, I don't think, was exactly drawn to the prisoner, except to keep him alive, because he had his own agenda. The prisoner, we don't know about affection, but he was certainly kind of astonished by the clemency, I think. But that sort of recantation, as again we know from other governments and other times, it's a highly complicated kind of document, and you're torn between the order that you be honest, that the instruction that you be honest, and your wish to kind of put your best foot forward to keep the clemency coming. What I'll never understand psychologically perhaps, is that this teacher obviously was totally risking his life and that of all his family, all his students, some of his students were involved in the plot. All these people faced certain death, and many of them found it, but he in fact didn't in this reign period. So he might have been drawn to the emperor. The emperor made some other gestures that are complicated. One was that families were usually arrested along with the principal. And in this teacher's case, he had two sons, and a mother. His father had died, and his wife had died just before this case erupted. But his mother was arrested along with him, and was incarcerated in some way in Beijing during the summer of 1729. And most people the highest death factor in prison, as in many other parts of the world, was of course illness, heat stroke, bad water, bad food, terrible living conditions and so on. But in the middle of this interrogation, the emperor suddenly ordered the teacher's mother released and sent back to her home. Now something like that it was not necessary, and it leads to what we could either call a fawning or a sincere letter from the prisoner, saying, "You're not only the most compassionate emperor I know, but you've even released my mother," which is how we know the mother was released, because there's no other document. But it seems like one of those moments in which a casual remark is accurate, which of course is what the historian is often trying to find. Sometimes just one fleeting remark makes sense. So I think there was a physical distance in this, but the acts of grace, if you like, complicated though they were from the emperor, obviously had a pretty strong effect, I think, on the prisoner. And when he went home to Hunan, back to his native place, he was expected to, and I gather he did, lecture about the emperor's benevolence in the very area in which he'd been lecturing about the emperor's hideous personal character and immoral nature. So even if this was seen as kind of a tiny business, that the man goes back, he recants, which is published, and then he goes back and he talks to presumably many of the same people he talked to before.
Isn't there an uncanny similarity with Mao Zedong and his use of 自我批评, the self-criticism, and the use of propaganda, and making these people confess to crimes they sometimes actually didn't even commit?
Well, I sparred, as I often spar in Chinese history, with whether to give this a sort of a clear-cut modern ring, and I didn't. I let people, if they wish, to make those associations. There are obviously commonalities in which you're sort of forcing people to say something they didn't do. In this case, I don't think the teacher confessed to anything that he had not done. I don't think that was on the agenda because he'd done so much, enough to be executed 50 times over. So there might be different kinds of lies in his statement. It's possible that those recreated passages of the original letter were not in the original letter. I don't think we're ever going to be able to find that out. The emperor, he was a curious man, this emperor, and he did send a copy of the whole original letter, apparently in fact, to somebody you mentioned in your own recent research, Ortai, Governor General Ortai, was an extremely powerful Manchu Governor General down by the Burmese border, Vietnam border, down in Yunnan and Guizhou, that region. And he was one of the emperor's closest confidants. And we have one secret message from Ortai saying, I've just received a copy of this treasonous letter. I'm indeed astonished that the emperor would trust me and would do such a thing. And that really surprised me very greatly. And then whether he told his friends, I don't know. But again, there's no transcript in the archives. Perhaps it was sent back and destroyed. But you raise a difficult question, and was this what later became thought reform or brainwashing or whatever phrase one wants to use? There's obviously intense moral coercion, and that echoes the previous question too, in such a situation. But I think probably in this case the man was not forced to lie. He chose to rephrase his past actions in the seamliest way possible, and perhaps he realized that pardon might really happen. It must have been an astonishing thought, and he had a long time to think it over.
Please, some more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the role of the scholars is very important, but it's important in different ways. I think it certainly matters that this particular conspirator, the teacher, he was only able to pass the lowest level of the exams, though that was a considerable achievement, a great achievement for somebody from a poor family. But he only got through the first level, so he could never have a successful official career. It would be very unlikely from what's called the licentiate level or the Xiuzai level. You could be respected in your local community, in your village or town even, but you wouldn't be on the national stage. But this teacher ran we know from the interrogation, he was in the situation of many hundreds of thousands of Chinese scholars. I always get my students to shudder by telling them that the Chinese examination system, you only kept your degree if you retook your final exams every 3 years and passed them. So all those of you with tenuous BAs or MA, yeah, I shudder to think of doing my finals again. I thought I would never see 1959 again. I don't want to. But you had to retake the exams, and this teacher had failed the retake. He'd passed the first time, and he'd failed the retake. And so he'd lost some of the prestige that he had, though he was still able to be a teacher because he knew the very basic classical curriculum. But it would be small-time teaching, so, village level or small-town level. But around somebody like this conspirator is the enormous group of brilliant Chinese scholars who have enormous knowledge and among whose ranks a fairly considerable number still in the 1720s would be what were called Ming loyalists, would still talk about the Ming, write about the Ming, think about the Ming, and even teach their students about how life used to be when the Ming, before the Manchus came. It's a little bit technical, but you would, I think, remember from the book that when the emperor perhaps gets most agitated, and it may be one of the reasons that lies behind his whole interest in this case, because this emperor was very busy, and this case was only one of hundreds of things coming across his desk, but the amount of time he spent on it is extraordinary. But fairly early in the case, in the transcripts from the interrogation, the emperor was told that one of the key conspirators held, what you mentioned, held the Jin Shi degree, the top degree in the entire Chinese system. So hard to get, so hard to get. 300 young men every 3 years, that's all, out of a population of 150, 200 million. The odds were terrifying. And one of the conspirators people thought was a holder of the Jin Shi degree. And I think this may have galvanized the emperor and perhaps made him act in certain ways, take this all the more seriously in early 1729. It turned out, and this to me took me in various sidetracks, but it's actually, I think, perhaps my favorite part of the book, at least in terms of research. It turned out that this man, this Jin Shi candidate, had not passed the top exam, but he raises a very different question. What about the people who said they had passed the top exams? Every so often in local newspapers, I'm sure, certainly there are in the United States, you find someone who's risen to dizzying political heights and turns out either not to have the degree they said, or to have claimed a military career and not to have even been an officer, for instance, claiming they'd been a lieutenant colonel, and yet they were, a junior corporal or something like that.
Isn't there a story of a historian like that nowadays?
Oh yes, there are. All historians better watch out for this sort of thing.
No, but historian who made this claim of a Vietnam career, I think.
Yes, there was. There was a famous case of a historian who claimed his teaching was based on his active service in Vietnam, and it turned out he'd never been there, let alone in combat. And that led to a scandal in the States. But this got me very interested in, though I haven't got the skill perhaps to do research, but it's a wonderful topic, I think, for others, the idea of the confidence trickster as claiming to have an exam degree. And what astonished me, and then I really have to be quiet about it and not talk too much, but what astonished me is when this man, who was very poorly dressed, came to scholars' homes saying he was a Jin Shi holder, though we have many interrogations, many transcripts in which this story was slowly put together, I cannot find a single case in which this confidence man claiming to be a Jin Shi was not received with absolute courtesy. A side of Chinese culture we often forget, the extreme courtesy among scholars and intellectuals. And he would be invited in and shown, he'd always ask if he could see the library. And he would take books out of the shelves and say things scholars love saying, like, fascinating, fascinating. And then he would get dinner, and then the host would usually ask something a little more precise about the text. And then a sort of slowly dawning knowledge would come that perhaps this man, this wanderer claiming to be a scholar, didn't really know very much. And then the more important discovery that he in fact couldn't read. But even then, I cannot find anybody actually kind of kicking the man out of the house. In every case, they seem to have put him up for the night, given him a morning meal, and in most cases, and this was touching, in most cases given him a small cash, enough to take him to the next town, and usually a small gift of food, and perhaps a warmer jacket or something like that, so that this man had been wandering around in central China for over a year. He was one of those rumor mongers who the story ended up with him, because he claimed to know the details of the usurpation in the palace in the 1720s. In his case, the police work led them to a coffin on a lonely road in North Yongxing County. And when there we have the knowledge, we have the details of the autopsy of the fake scholar. So we actually know the clothes he was buried in, and the police put together a picture of those he talked to. So the scholarship, comes in many ways, and there were clearly very fine scholars who had defended the Ming through, to the death, and it was their children who kept the texts of their fathers and grandfathers, who in several cases were executed. To know the clothes he was buried in, and the police put together a picture of those he talked to. So the scholarship, comes in many ways, and there were clearly very fine scholars who had defended the Ming through, to the death, and it was their children who kept the texts of their fathers and grandfathers, who in several cases were executed. And that strikes us perhaps as the hardest blow of all from our point of view, from the emperor's point of view. These were perhaps the most dangerous people because they were good scholars who were reading what they knew was treason, and they weren't handing it over to the state. So they had to go first, even before the people who tried this jerry-built attempt to overthrow the emperor with non-existent military forces. So that theme of killing scholars with this same compassionate emperor, goes along with these multiple levels.
And not just killing, but digging them up, right? When they are dead.
In some cases, I mentioned disinterring the corpses and publicly humiliating. There was one lady there.
I would like to know how the rumor stayed safe, because it's possible one to the other got into several years. When we passed something on.
Yes, it changes again and again and again. Well, we do find stories growing and changing. That there seem to be some rumors that were more persistent than others. They involved stories about the emperor's, the goings-on in the palace, and some of this was obviously just kind of scandal mongering. But other times, you go back through different figures, and I think probably the records are not thorough enough to trace, every single detail of most of these rumors. The transcripts usually say this was the rumor about the emperor killing his brother, or this was the rumor about the emperor's cruelty, or the emperor's greed, for instance, for money. And in most cases, some version of that story seemed to be moderately, handed on to different people. There are some of them turned out to be, some of the rumor spreaders seem to have been those who'd been in the palace of at least one of the princes who'd later been killed. So these were disaffected associates of a murdered prince. Now those people would be bitter, and they apparently spread stories, and in some cases they were tracked, well in most cases they were tracked down. Several of those people reminds us of a different side of Chinese court life. Because they were working in a princely household in the women's quarters, they were actually eunuchs. They were the castrated males. It wasn't only the emperor who had eunuchs, but I hadn't actually been sure about this, but the senior princes apparently had eunuchs in their court. And some of these eunuchs were sent into exile for defaming the emperor in Beijing. And as they apparently as prisoners came along the roads of China, they would kind of spread gossip and stories in the evenings when they had their meal, before being locked up for the night. And in at least one case, the jailers spread the story because their prisoners were telling such good stories. And you can imagine these kind of jailers from Beijing with an excited group of villagers, in a way, talking scandal mongering. But trying to piece the different stories together is difficult. Doctors seem to have done a lot of rumor spreading. After looking at the patient, they would linger, maybe have a meal in the society at the time and talk, and they would have seen a thing or two. There were a lot of peripatetic physicians in this story moving around within a given area, and like fortune tellers, and sometimes feuding with each other, like doctors sometimes do, and telling contradictory stories. But that's actually a wonderful question. I think we can't solve it because we only trace the rumor spreaders. The emperor's sort of assumption is it's the same rumor, And if the officials found more or less that rumor, that was enough for them. So they don't usually trace tiny variations.
Thank you very much. Well, you see, I've not been finding flaws with you. I want to thank you for your replies, and maybe you should come back and we have another session. Monique. Yeah.
Well, before I'll let you go, I want to thank Jonathan Spence to bring this wonderful story also here in Christopher for the John Adams Institute. And I want to thank Bernard for introducing Professor Spence. And I want to thank some more people. The publishing house Bezige Bij, who are Dr. Spence, Dutch publisher, and Penguin Books Benelux, book importers, and both parties supported the John Adams Institute financially to make this occasion possible. Well, as I said earlier, Professor Spence will sign his books here in this hall somewhere. I think maybe at the table, I'm not sure. We'll see. And there will be drinks outside of the door. And I would like you to fill out the forms, if you would be so kind, the questionnaires I put on the chair, because they are very helpful to us. You can even find more information about the John Adams Institute at the information desk outside. And although we had a wonderful evening tonight talking about China, I really loved that, to hear it again. We'll do something completely different on June 11th with Barbara Kingsolver in the Rode Hood. And something very different on June 26th with Norman Mailer and his wife Norris Mailer and George Plimpton doing a kind of play, you could say, written by Terry Quinn and George Plimpton with works of Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway. So please come and see that in the Stad Schouwburg later on June. But if you want to sign up for these lectures, maybe it's a good idea to also sign up to become a member of the John Adams. It's only €20 and you will get all the posts and you will never miss one of our lectures like we had tonight. So I want to thank you again and please come back and thanks again, both of you. Thank you.